Good evening. In his early book of poems, Hymns and Qualms, Peter Cole was already building altars, risky altars, constantly remade in Cole's darting wordplay and many-stranded voices. Altars all the same, even if invisible. He proclaimed in the poem Speech's Hedge, "Words are wood for the vanished altar," and proposed, "but to resist by form alone the course of the world." Cole pressed this restless quest forward in the poems of the book Things on Which I've Stumbled, 2008, and most recently in the rich, various, and revelatory The Invention of Influence. In this new book, Cole seems to unite his multiplicities, his influences and confluences, a celebrated translator of medieval Hebrew, his anthology, The Dream of the Poem, Hebrew Poetry from Muslim and Christian Spain, 950 to 1492, and his Poetry of Kabbalah are classics. Cole also translates prolifically from modern Hebrew, the work, among others, of that poet of bitter conscience, Aaron Shabtai. And he translates from Arabic, for instance, the majestic work of the Palestinian poet Taha Muhammad Ali. As a translator, Cole contains eras and cultures that the course of the world seems to drive apart. He's also a scholar, author with Adina Hoffman of the remarkable study Sacred Trash, The Lost and Found World of the Cairo Geniza. All of these personae, these forces, flow together in the erudite, mystical, earthy, wildly imaginative poems of The Invention of Influence. The poems pay tribute to that mischievous Kabbalist master critic, Harold Bloom, and meditate on what it means to live in language, to find oneself endlessly translated by the words one has inherited. At the heart of the book is a narrative poem about the psychoanalyst Victor Tausk, a brilliant disciple of Freud's who was tortured by that discipleship and committed suicide. Tausk's late paper on the origin of the influencing machine in schizophrenia gives Cole a working myth for his explorations of the personal and impersonal drama of language, of the weird condition that is tradition, as he says, on what it means to receive and to refashion. Constantly making and unmaking sense, Cole's poems crackle with puns, rend sense as they render it, and press on the void in avoidance. These are neither pranks nor affectations. It's a poetry that challenges romantic illusions of singularity and proprietorship in the very grain of language, as in this riff on the syllable O, O-W. So we own and owe what we know, which precipitates this further formulation, pages later, knowing is never owned. Cole's is an art responsive to many voices and yet composed by a clearly singular master. I honor the mastery. I'm not alone in honoring it. Peter Cole has received much recognition, including a MacArthur Grant, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and an award in literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Please welcome Peter Cole.
I'm going to sound a little bit like Aunt Petra from the attic of the hospice. I woke up this morning, and the horror for the poet, I no longer had a voice. You know, that Ron Padgett poem, I found my voice the other day. It was lying on the table. I hadn't noticed it before. So it was that horror. I was late for the train. I overslept, and there was somebody coming to pick me up, and I saw him coming up to the guest house where I was staying, and I went to shout out to him, "Nia!" And there was nothing left. So that was Aunt Petra. You've got sort of Uncle Pete, the walking kazoo at this point. So I can only apologize and say, bear with me, and who knows what's going to happen next. But first, I want to thank all of you for coming. Incredible view as we have here. Thank Rosanna. That was a really beautiful introduction. I'm surrounded here by people whose work I admire left and right, and humbled by that. And in a way, I'm between a rock and a hard place, or maybe a rock and a soft place, in deciding what to read today. Because as you know, I'm also speaking tomorrow afternoon, right, at the Collegium, and part of me I don't know how many people here will attend both events, and I assume that
all of them.
Yeah, all of them, right? Fingerprints will be taken, retinal images. But I want to honor everybody's presence by representing the book as it is. On the other hand, I want to honor everyone's presence in both places by not repeating myself. So what I've decided to do is to read a selection of short poems. And the other thing I could do, of course, is just read the whole long poem, which is a kind of operatic thing. Take about 45 minutes, length of a normal poetry reading. I have had a few requests to do that. But when I woke up this morning and my voice was no longer there, I thought, well, that solved that problem. So I'm going to play it safe and read some shorter poems, and then I'll read some excerpts, a few, 3 or 4 excerpts from the longer poem, so you'll get a sense at least of some of what's running through that. But I'm not going to read things that will be part of my tomorrow's thing as a talk, but woven through that talk are going to be excerpts of the long poem and the more character-based, dramatic, operatic, Tausk-related. Rosanna mentioned Victor Tausk, the protagonist of the poem. So all that will be in tomorrow's talk, and I'm going to talk about the genesis of that poem and sort of why all that material is so important to me. And it's the title poem of the book. But the other 2 parts of this book deal with both influence and invention every bit as much as the title poem do. And all the poems that I picked today present almost kind of other takes, commentaries on, or let's say different facets of my understanding, evolving, continually changing understanding of the ways in which influence plays a complicated and prickly, crucial, slippery, complicated, central role in our lives. And it also deals with invention, and it kind of takes both up and on conventional wisdom's understanding of invention. Right? Invention not as something that comes to us out of the blue, but invention in the classical sense of discovery, of a kind of reorienting of attention, an adjustment of the frame. So that is that's sort of the theme that's going to be running through the poems that I've chosen. No one, I think, has put all that together in one sentence better than Rosanna herself in her writing about translation, when she says at one point that translation is a model of cognition and survival. In other words, not translation as some derivative, weakly secondary thing, but translation as an essential human activity and as something that's critical for our notions and for the dynamic of what it means to create in an original fashion, what it means to be listening now, what it means for me to be talking and paying attention to your paying attention. So with that, I'm going to jump right in. On being partial, and this is partial. Rosanna mentioned the sort of, I like to layer poems and make them available for multiple readings. Partial here is partial in every sense of the word. On being partial. I'm partial to what's possible, he thought. Not the ineffable, distant, devoid of insistence and temperament that tampers or tramples, not the impersonal. But that which hovers here, between the eye of the opening and the us of your possible listening, now, or in the imperfect tense and tension of what, in fact, articulates the eternal. That abstract revelation, and slippery duration, to which it seems I'm given, and because of which I'm never finished with anything, as though living itself were an endless translation. Song of the Shattering Vessels. On one level, this poem is simply about a kind of rough moment on a traffic island on the Upper West Side about 2.5 years ago. But many of you in the audience will probably recognize the title, Song of the Shattering Vessels. There's an echo there of the Kabbalistic myth of creation, which I'm not going to go into the whole song and dance. You don't need to know it. We're all vessels. We're all shattered at some level. That's all you need to know. The title came afterwards, but the notion that there is a kind of mythic paradigm beneath what's happening in this poem is what drew me. Either the world is coming together, or else the world is falling apart. Here, now, along these letters, against the walls of every heart. Today, tomorrow within its weather, the end or beginning's about to start. The world impossibly coming together, or very possibly falling apart. Now the lovers' mouths are open. Maybe the miracle's about to start. The world within us coming together because all around us it's falling apart. Even as they speak, he wonders. Even as the fear departs. Is that the world coming together? Can they keep it from falling apart? The image gradually is growing sharper. Now the sound is like a dart. It seemed that their world was coming together, but in fact, it was falling apart. That's the nightmare. That's the terror. That's the Isaac of this art, which sees that the world might come together if only we're willing to take it apart. The dream, the lure, isn't an answer that might be plotted along some chart as we know the world that's coming together within our knowings, falling apart. So one of the other threads that I want to weave through the reading tonight and the selection of poems is a particular kind of influence, maybe for a writer, one of the most important kind, for anybody, one of the most important kinds of influence, and also one of the loaded and prickly, most prickly and crucial and complicated and slippery and all the other things I said before, which is to say friendship, which has had a decisive effect on my writing life. And it's also had a decisive effect on my professional life and my intellectual life. And in particular, there's a friend who is a friend of several people in this room, including David Nierenberg, one of my hosts for tonight and tomorrow. It's Maria Rosa Menokal, who is a great scholar of Andalusian literature, Andalusian studies, who passed away 2 years ago. And she was a neighbor of mine in New Haven recently. Before that, we were corresponding between Jerusalem and New Haven. And this poem is for her, who's really written in many ways about her, although she makes a kind of cameo appearance. I mean, the poem is dedicated to her, so you know it's for her, but she appears anonymously here. And the poem is about, on the one hand, the park where I live, across the street from where we live in New Haven, down the street from where she lived. We were neighbors. It's about the sort of connective tissue in the park, the way the paths come together, about the ramification of branches, the kind of patterns of trees in there, and the kind of ramifying nature of friendship. So there's lots of trees. This is the University of Chicago, so we'll just up the ante a little bit here and tell you a little bit of the Kabbalistic things. So one of the things, that previous poem, I said it had a kind of Kabbalistic substratum. In many ways, for me, was a kind of translation of certain Kabbalistic myths of creation into or out of a very real, personal, grounded situation. This poem came from when we moved to the apartment. My wife Adina's here. When we moved to the apartment we live in now and saw this park, and I have the Poetry of Kabbalah over here. I saw the paths in that park. I thought they look like the Kabbalistic spherot, which, for those of you who don't know, they're sort of the channels of influence, sort of cosmic, heavenly channels of influence. I've worked with Kabbalistic material for a long, long time. Honestly, I never really understood the spherot. I mean, I felt like I understood them, but I couldn't really get my brain around them. And yet, when I saw this park, I thought, I'm getting closer. And I knew that eventually something would come out of that park. What came out of it was something much more complicated than I had anticipated. But so this poem encodes the map of the spherot. There are 10 spherot, 10 spheres, let's say, or channels of influence that are connected in very complicated ways. So you don't have to know that. That's in the notes. And you would never know it unless you were already familiar with that material. But why not? We'll put that out there. What is? For MRM in memoriam. The Norway maple's chartreuse crown in April ciphers autumn's flares, startling with mace-like spikelets of flowers swelling over the pass of that square where we wander adrift in the branching, or is it what's branching adrift in us? Wafted as if afloat on a wisdom, flowing through this city forest. The grid encodes in understanding. Those who stroll past tines of elms, who'll wade the shade of summer's linden and trace the mottled bark of plains, move as though of their own accord, but under invisible gates of a grace, born in their being borne along, or gradually dying to the spell of that place where dogs are walked and judgment is rendered, and power as weakness brings down limbs, where mercy's continual averment is tendered, and children at recess dart into rings, where a woman's will surges through her, sitting alone in the rinse of her cancer, as the vapor of chatters released to the air. All part of the terrible splendor. The weeping cherry shedding petals, like snow in an ancient ocular rhyme. The site, of course, is a site of convention, the tiniest of triumphs over time. And yet somehow the saraband combines as majesty. The rupture and gentle carriage of kindness, the wind's extended winding kiss, the almost now actual a marriage. Not so much of opposites as, say, analogous aspects. Exits to entrances, or attics holding an axial weave of sound's foundation. The praxis perfecting opens into an instant's happiness, putting us back in the business of funneling the whole shebang, which Kabbalists have given a name. What is? So that's for Maria, and in a way for David also, who shares my deep love for her. I want to continue the sort of Spanish Andalusian, or let's say the Spanish thread here. First of all, by pointing out that I have Fundador brandy in this cup, the very fine Spanish brandy, which is helping my pipes. Are you hearing me okay, more or less? Surprisingly hard to get Fundador. It's a much undervalued brandy. But I want to continue by reading a adaptation from a Spanish poem by one of my favorite poets. David, you're going to pronounce the Santob de, do you know the Carrion? Okay, Santob de Carrion. He also wrote, he's an important, he's from the 14th century, an important Spanish poet. Antonio Machado, in his Moral Proverbs, refers back to Santob as a kind of hero. Santob is a Spanish version of the name, the Hebrew name, Shem Tov. Santob, Shem Tov. He also wrote in Hebrew. He's a marvelous Hebrew poet. And I've translated a lot of his Hebrew poems. Spanish I don't read, but I have some French, and with a little, X-ray vision and help from certain scholars who have translated his poems literally and written monographs about them, and some intuition. I've had a kind of ongoing connection with Santob's work for years. So he shows up periodically in my books, and I sort of can't get enough of him. So this is a poem called More for Santob. I'm just going to read you 2 of the 4 sections here. 14th century Castile, More for Santob. The sections have titles. The first one is called Everyone's So High. My title's not his. Everyone's so high on yes. Nothing has made me happier, though, than the day I asked my lover if she had another. And she said, no. 3, how friends act. Pretty good for the 14th century. That's the problem. It's all downhill from there. How friends act. Is anything better than a pair of scissors which separates those that separate them? They do this not because they're bitter, but out of desire to meet again. When they're joined, they do no harm, hand to hand and lip to lip. Only when parted can they destroy. That's how strong their loyalty is. Those who'd learn what brotherhood means and how friends act when all is done should watch as scissors make one of two, and when they have to, 2 of 1. 4, for being born. For being born on a bush of thorns, the rose is certainly worth no less. Nor should wine be scorned that's fine, but comes from lesser parts of the vine. The hawk is likewise no less blessed, because it was born in a humble nest. And proverbs aren't less noble or true for being spoken by a Jew. I think that Fundador is helping. The Qualmist Aging. My second book of poems is called Hymns and Qualms. The well-known editor wrote me a congratulatory note afterwards saying, here, after I will always think of you as not the psalmist, but the Qualmist. I wrote this poem for him, but those of us in the audience of a certain age, and probably those of us in the audience under that age, are very familiar with the powers of medication, the wonders of pharmaceuticals. And I myself have very bad arthritis and have 2 artificial hips and blah, 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 and have look like a normal person because of the wonders of those pharmaceuticals. So this is a poem kind of in homage to the pharmaceutical industry and its biblical precedents. The Qualmist Aging. I lift my eyes to my pills. Whence cometh my help? It takes a little while. Right. That poem's been around for quite a while. I've lived on pills for a long time now. But I chose to put it in this book when I was visiting the gravesite, my father's gravesite, with my mother and with two of their oldest and dearest friends who had grave plots right next to theirs. So in other words, there were 4 people going to be buried in the same spot. One person has passed away and is in the ground. The other 3 are there. And it's a really beautiful place. We're looking up towards the hills. And so my parents obviously are Jewish. The other 2 people are Catholic. The woman is an old friend of mine. The family is a devout Catholic. She had a little bench put in by her gravesite. And it said on the bench, "I turn my eyes to the hills." And so she was basically looking at her gravesite. We looked at the bench, and I recited the Qualms staging with the pills in it, and she burst out laughing. And I thought, if she can laugh over her own grave site with this, the poem's doing something. So now I've written down the wrong page number for the poem I want to read next, which is, second, Quatrains for a Calling. Where'd that go? Okay. So one of my other hosts tonight is the Poetics program, and I see some students, and John Wilkinson's here, acknowledge your sponsorship also. Thank you for hosting me. The question of vocation, of writerly vocation, is something that I just sort of been obsessed with all along. Zen mind, beginner's mind. Maybe it's because I translate so much, so you translate and then you go back to writing and you feel like a beginner. On the other hand, I think everybody feels like a beginner all the time. The blank page reminds you. And after finishing this long translation project, The Poetry of Kabbalah, when I did go back to my study and my desk and cleared it all off and sort of, no more influences, no more embracing influences, let's see what's going to happen in front of the blank desk, the clean desk on the blank page, I returned to sort of basic questions, and I asked myself some of the questions that are in this poem, but then the poem morphed, as these poems tend to do, and the poem really became a poem about, well, the kind of thing that an MFA student might be thinking about, or any writing student. So the writing students among you, if you want to identify with this, feel free. Audience members, by the same token, but it's a nasty little poem, and it's really about me. Quatrains for a Calling. Why are you here? Who have you come for, and what would you gain? Where is your fear? Why are you here? You've come so near, or so it would seem. You can see the grain in the paper. That's clear. But why are you here when you could be elsewhere, earning a living, or actually learning? Why should we care why you're here? Is that a tear? Yes, there's pressure behind the eyes, and there are peers. But why are you here? At times, it sears. The pressure and shame and the echoing pain. What do you hear now that you're here? The air's so severe. It calls for equipment, which comes at a price. And you've volunteered. Why? Are you here? What will you wear? What will you do if it turns out you've failed? How will you fare? Why are you here when it could take years to find out what? It's all so slippery and may not cohere. And yet, you're here. Is it what you revere? How deep does that go? How do you know? Do you think you're a seer? Is that why you're here? Do you have a good ear? For praise or for verse? Can you handle a curse? Define persevere. Why are you here? It could be a career. Summer syntax. Saxifrage arabis phlox, Lobelia, euphorbia, nasturtium, Coreopsis, gara, flax, Brunera, salvia, rubrum, delphinium, snapdragon, alyssum, bacopa, yarrow, thyme, viola, cress, and chrysanthemum, convolvulus and clematis that climb over the flowering fescue, the prairie mallow and sage, with lucerne sisyrinchium to the rescue, of spirit surveying the cage of its inching calibrations, luring us out to stare into this constellation's efflorescence as everywhere. So Rosanna mentioned there's sort of more fructifying or benevolent dimensions of influence, and some of that I think has been clear in the poems I've read, but obviously doors swing both ways on these things and very rapidly, and influence run amok, or influence that has all kinds of eddies and swells and undercurrents and undertows to it, are every bit as forceful in our lives. And one manifestation of that is paranoia. There should be a course in all sort of writerly programs on, right? Paranoia 101, right? And there's rhyme, there's formalism, there's free verse, there's language poetry. There should be just a course on, paranoia and how to recognize it when it rears its head. And the long poem, of course, is about schizophrenia and a further extension of that. In a way, this whole book emerged out of a kind of meditation on paranoia. My mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, with dementia, and gradually descended into that vortex that many of us know about. And she became quite paranoid, and I was, for a while, one of the only people who was able to deal with her, partly through a kind of poetic association, until she told me to fuck off. And then she died a couple weeks later. But in a way, dealing with her paranoia brought me closer to her than I had ever been. She was a dancer, high-strung, theatrical life, and the paranoia didn't just come with the Alzheimer's, of course. She was kind of deeply paranoid all along at some level, and she's someone I think paranoia got the better of her throughout her life. The sort of comic version of it would be like when Adina and I came back to New Jersey once to visit my parents, maybe 10 years ago or something. We came downstairs for breakfast. The table was set for a very nice breakfast. The coffee's out there. There's half and half on the table, and I pour some half and half in my coffee, and my mother said, "Don't touch that." I said, "Why?" I mean, first of all, she put it out there, and I said, "The expiration date's 10 days from now." She said, "They lie." And it was, she wasn't exactly kidding. So this poem, a bit like the Quatrains for a Calling, I think in a way, I don't know if it started out about me or about her. At the beginning, for a while, it kind of went, you want some Fundador? It really does feel very good. You should have heard me tell the taxi driver to take me to Hyde Park. The guy looks at me. Who doesn't speak English in this cab? Was the real dynamic there. So in a way, I'm not sure really when this poem started. I was reading about paranoia in order to help me understand her and what she was going through. But as I was writing, I realized that I was also writing about myself. And in fact, the pronoun at the beginning, I think, was he. I'm not a raving paranoid. I'm just kind of the normal writerly. You got the right normal writerly paranoia. But then the pronoun shifted to she, and the poem went in a very different direction. So paranoia, a primer. The paranoid parses all she hears until it sounds like what she fears. She fears what's always about to be said, and so her fear is endlessly fed. Around her head, like a halo, it hovers, a nimbus of hatred of self that smothers others as well in the smog of its knowing, that knowing is never what's really going on, and so on it goes, further and further from what love does. She ponders the sea of poisonous thoughts that teach not a thing, but can be taught. Within the whirlpool of her mind, she's caught as life is left behind, like a swimmer swept out to sea on a tide which holds that nothing she's had to hide. A loom loud through the warp of her soul, set in a room beyond her control, and behind what anyone said everywhere. Such were the fruits of her despair. The choreography of her defense against the contraptions of influence, the strings pulled as though from afar, jerking the puppets that we are. And the last short poem I'll read, before I get to just a couple from the long poem, I mentioned before this notion of spherot and the Kabbalistic spheres and my sort of inability to understand them. It's a bit like Dante, like Eliot talking about Dante, right? He says, you know, in his essay on Dante, he said that we love poems before we understand them. And I think that's just true with so many things, certainly with people. It was true for me in reading about Kabbalah with angels. I'm ostensibly, at least by Israeli, I live in Jerusalem half the year. By Israeli standards, I'm a secular person. I don't observe many religious rituals. I mean, I do think of myself as a religious person, but by sort of the standards of the worlds I live in, I'm not a religious person. And certainly, angels, do I believe in angels? I mean, I guess not, right? Not the way most people believe in angels, but I believe in them when I'm reading about them. And I notice that when I'm reading these Kabbalistic texts, when the angels are coming up, you can sort of feel the wings, you know, quivering and fluttering and hovering. I get a little excited. My mind is racing. Something interesting is about to happen. I don't believe in angels, but, you know, again, in the reading I do. And so I sort of put the frame there. I mentioned earlier about invention as a redirection of the frame. I put the frame around angels. Let's just think about angels for a couple of months. And let's just write about angels and see what happens. And suddenly, the world actually became, was pretty interesting to begin with, but it became even more interesting. I think we were coming to Chicago once. I remember coming on the plane, walking around Hyde Park. I think one of these quatrains was composed in Hyde Park, if memory serves. Which one? The elevated. Maybe it has to do with the L. There is I wasn't going to read that one, but all right. My wife, she knows everything that I've forgotten. So I'll read you a couple of sections from this. The poem is called Actual Angels, because what interested me was not the angels in the texts, but what happens to the translation from reading to living when you carry something that sticks with you from your reading around into your life, and then it actually makes these just little, very subtle changes in your day, in your behavior, in your interactions with people. So, in other words, when they enter action, the acts that we engage in. So, actual angels. And I will read, let me just remind myself here which ones I'm going to read. Okay, I'm going to read you 5 short sections. Gone is the griffin, the phoenix, the fawn. Only angels in the poem live on. as characters catching the light between things. No, I blew that one. We'll start again. And let me just give credit where credit is due. In Jewish scholarship, this is considered a very important thing, right? You acknowledge your influences. Borges has a wonderful essay about angels, and he says it's very strange. Nobody writes about griffins or phoenixes or fawns anymore, but people still write about angels, right? Which is one of those incredibly true, weird things. So that's where that first line came from. Gone is the griffin, the phoenix, the fawn. Only angels in the poem live on, as characters catching the light between things, as carriers of currents from the wings, of thinking we know where we're going and then getting somewhere, despite our intention. Maybe an angel's confused with an angle, so often because the slip lays bare something these envoys are trying to tell us, that what we're missing is already there. Angels also act like classics, tilting us toward the oddly real, as with the crust of their reputation, they block off access to it as well. How is it that creatures with names like Anaphiel, Shak, Dehuzia, Asbuga, and Yophiel could possess the power to raise a person up to a temple within from his hell? Angels are letters, said Abulafia. In us like mind as the presents hum. No one knows what a year will bring, but the world to come is the word to come. And so I'd like to end with, apart from one more sip of Fundador, and which really does have miraculous powers. So I picked 4 sections from the Invention of Influence, the long poem, that are more or less self-standing. In that, they've been published as self-standing poems in journals, but you don't really need to know anything about Tausk and Freud and Lou Andreas Salome and the whole cast of characters around them. I'll just say that I was drawn to to the figure of Tausk as someone who was a kind of, or the whole story of Tausk is a kind of case study in susceptibility, right? For Keats talks about negative capability, and then there's also negative capability, like too much capability, too much reception, and there's obliteration, and there's serious distortion, and there's madness, and there's worse. And so but I found myself very, very much drawn to this, in many ways, exemplary tragic figure. Very few other people would call him exemplary. And yet, as I went further and further into this case, I couldn't help but be reminded of other forms, other traditions of influence that might have saved him. He committed suicide at the age of, I think he was 39, 40. But that he himself and Freud himself were, that they were both kind of unconsciously drawn to, which is a kind of Jewish tradition of influence, the one that we find in the rabbis of the Talmud in particular, which is not all sweetness and light, mind you, but it is one in which, as I said, the notion of transmission is something to be embraced, and the idea that poetic tropes or that ideas, that impulses are passed along from person to person doesn't mean that they're diminished as you move away from the source. On the contrary, things are enhanced, developed, and in many ways made more interesting. So The parts that I'll read represent those rabbis. They represent various other distortions of influence, and they also represent a kind of directly literal physical application of influence. The influence machine that Rosanna mentioned that Tausk writes about is what schizophrenics describe. Recently there was a guy in the Naval Yard in Annapolis or somewhere near Annapolis who shot up a bunch of people, and he claimed he was being controlled. It was something through his computer. I don't remember what. When I was growing up, it was through mercury fillings that voices came. Earlier in the 20th century, it was through radio waves. It always has to do with certain technological things that are very common. So that's one kind of influence machine. And in the Paranoia poem about my mother, there's a sense also that we're being controlled. But there's another kind of influence machine in the history of ideas, and that's in physics. And many of you will remember in high school physics class, and for me it was 9th grade, you know that experiment where you have this generator and two people touch or something, like static electricity jumps between two people's hands, and then your hair stands up, right? It's as if you can see I'm connected all the time to an influence machine. That explains my hairdo. So the first poem I'm going to read is about that kind of influence machine as a kind of figure for some of these other things. Just to give you a taste of the Tausk, this is the beginning of part 2 of the poem, and there's an epigraph to the second section, which has nothing to do with what I'm going to read, but also be kind of interesting just to toss in, which says, "Now what is going to happen? Only Freud and God know." Tausk, summer 1919. Invention isn't godlike. It doesn't create out of nothing. It works through what's found. It discovers, and much like influence, it recovers a charge that's already there, potentially in the air. All bodies are capable of being mechanically thrown into a state in which they're said to be electrified. Francis Hawksby, the elder, England, 1706, constructed what's now known as an influence machine. A crank turned a spindle which rubbed insulated matter against a spinning globe of glass, an emptied vessel, really a vacuum chamber filled with mercury vapor. The friction caused a shift and transfer of such force along a conducting body, it took on a luminous glow inside a bordered void. The glow of life, some called it, shimmering like a TV. And so power could be sent through a person's hand or room and then across the spinning globe, giving light to a body by it. In these orbs of matter, Hawksby observed, we have some little resemblance of the grand phenomena of the universe. What looks like nothing holds everything, including a warning to all would-be inventors. Remember, machines of this sort aren't toys, and they're dangerous when mishandled. A basic contraption comprising a charged pint-sized capacitor can incapacitate or kill. Precisely this afflicts the plagiarist, or something like the X he is. What's old and has long been known seems to him new and becomes his own. He's all reception, all alone. And the fruits are manifold, though the root is one. Thwarted ambition and a sense at heart, the doctor describes as a kind of cry. I cannot bear not to have been the first to have uttered a certain thing. The great that was inevitable, right? The great Talmudic sage Eliezer, before he became a rabbi and master, and said all he said he'd heard from his teacher, was hungry and wanted to learn. He was 22 years old, the son of a farmer. He told he was leaving the land to study in the city, though he wasn't ready. His father forbade him from tasting food and leaving until he had finished plowing a long furrow filled with stones. Then he was gone. Such was his hunger, he still hadn't eaten, that while he was walking, he picked up a stone to put in his mouth. He'd eaten dirt all his life. Eliezer was hungry. The son of a farmer, unfed by his father's furrows and future, he reached an inn and spent the night. At dawn, he went to Ben Zakkai, famous already as wisdom's father, and sat at his feet there in the dust. A stench wafted up from his breath. How long has it been, my son, since you've eaten? Silence. He asked him again, and again nothing. And Ben Zakkai taught him, only when hunger becomes insufferable, not just to oneself, but to others, will it bear fruit it doesn't devour. As the odor is rising from your mouth, so your fame for learning will travel. And he would confess, a lifetime later, a single dog can lick from the sea more than I've managed to take from my teachers. That a son can't bear his name is a shame or a sham, like one who's not quite his own man, a son with a U to a larger system, a son with an O of address or an O is before the H of a sigh says, I am only I in relation, and yet sons make a nation. Sons for some are angels, for others baubles or squinting infants, a kind of endorsement, or not what was meant, or torment. A grown son referred to as such, it's true, is often a kind of embarrassment. One son is said to be God, or gods. Another's merely a mother's deity. A son is a link in a chain that links, like a gang's or a tutelary. Being a son involves a bond or being bound. It's a tie that blinds and defines, that keeps one in line. At times, it's like wine. But then it's a chink in the good old armor. The favorite son is often a charmer. A son might marry the farmer's daughter and have sons or sons' daughters. Certain sons are marked for slaughter. Once a son, always a son, even when one is a father. But sometimes a son is a door to the father. And then that son's seeing is double. And so he believes that relation is noble and the sole source of becoming singular so as to matter somehow to others. Thus, a son gives birth to his brothers. That a son is a name, then, isn't a game, though it is up for grabs. And that's not a shame, it's a tradition. A son's an emission, desires expression, a bearer of cues and clues, a spooked thing, and maybe an influence. or just a fluency, demanding or dormant, through you, through me.